right, here we go. We're live. Let me make sure. Yeah, no. Okay, we're good. All right. 3, 2. Actually, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna bring you in. You can hear me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take you out and then bring you in as our guest. All right, here we go. I can see you. And you can see me through the screen. All right. 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to Real World, Real Talk with Dr. D.Z. Cofield. The show represents captivating conversations and insightful information to encourage and inspire you with all you need to become the best you can possibly be. And now, your host for Real World, Real Talk, Dr. D.Z. Cofield.
What's up, everybody? DZ Cofield here, welcoming you to Real World, Real Talk. I want to thank all of our faithful listeners for being with us. And man, I have such an exciting show planned for us today. Really a relevant, on-time word to help you manage and make it through this pandemic season. There are a lot of us who are struggling. And, you know, one of the things that I've learned in life is you really can't get to a solution or resolution until you first identify the cause. And we're going to be dealing with today one of the causes of what we are feeling and what we are going through, and then the unhealthy manifestations of what we are going through. Now, just a couple of housekeeping matters. You can follow me on all social media outlets at DZ Cofield. You can also catch me at RWRT DZ, RWRT, Real World, Real Talk, DZ. Man, we would love to hear from you. Give us show suggestions, whatever it is that's on your mind. We would love to hear from you and be able to serve you. I also want to say for this Memorial Day weekend, man, I hope you have a blessed Memorial Day weekend. This is really a tough time, to be honest with you. And I think for many people, this is taking Memorial Day to a whole nother level. We are looking in our country, over 95,000 people have passed away due to COVID-19. Just got a call this past week that a dear friend, somebody that I've worked with, we've been on both sides of the aisles fighting for the good of our community. Mr. Keith Wade tragically lost his fight to COVID-19. And it was really surreal to hear first that he was in the hospital for COVID-19. And I'll be honest with you, when I heard it, I thought, well, man, Keith is going to be okay. You know, he's a strong guy, you know, takes care of himself. He's in good shape. And then to get word that he passed away was absolutely shocking. And people from the mayor, Congresswoman, and others in our community who have worked with Keith has worked with them. He was part of the Mickey Leland tree. And so it's just sad to lose a brother like that, who was so passionate and so caring in so many ways. And we certainly want to lift in prayer his family and friends at his loss. It's definitely a loss that we will feel, not just today, but we will feel in the coming days. This month, May, is Mental Health Awareness Month. And so we've been focusing on several different aspects of that. Last week, we talked about the issue of anger and how many people are angry and really don't realize that they're angry. Today, we're kind of doing a prequel to talk about some of the things that can make you angry or bring you to that place of anger and frustration. And one of the things we discovered last week is that anger is really a secondary emotion. And so, you know, while you may count to 10 and try to dissipate the anger in your life, the truth of the matter is until you get to the root, you're never going to find resolution for that thing that's making you angry. Man, I'm excited today to have with us in our show this sister. Got a chance to meet her just on a social level and listening to her talk. You know, periodically she starts sharing and I'm like, man, I've got to get this sister on to be with our guests on Real World, Real Talk. Dr. Jamie Eaddy is the founding executive director of I Just Believe Ministries Incorporated, a nonprofit organization committed to ending violence against women and children. IJB provides direct support and advocacy for survivors of sexual abuse and intimate partner violence. They also empower churches and community organizations to support survivors by providing awareness, education, and unique learning experiences. She is the founding CEO of Thoughtful Transitions, an organization that provides a holistic approach to supporting individuals navigating grief and loss. As a loss navigation specialist and chaplain, Dr. Eaddy is uniquely gifted to journey with individuals and families dealing with loss of every kind. With a unique blend of gifts, Dr. Eaddy wears many hats as an ordained minister, chaplain, death doula, author, and poet. She is a chaplain resident at the Albert Einstein Medical Center, where she provides support to the intensive care and neonatal care units. She also serves as an associate minister, primarily responsible for congregational care and wellness at the St. Paul's Baptist Church in Philadelphia. Dr. Eaddy is the author of Getting Naked to Get Free, a very personal and provocative collection of poetry written to empower those whose lives have been impacted by violence and addiction. She loves preaching, 90s hip hop poetry. Let me get that right. 90s hip hop and poetry, pink lipstick, RISPA, she can tell you about that, and shoes. She recently earned a doctorate of ministry degree from Colgate Rochester Crozier Divinity School and resides in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And the most important thing about a Philly resident, they've got to know where to get a for real cheesesteak. We welcome to Real World, Real Talk, Dr. Jamie Eaddy. Thank you. Dr. Eaddy, how are you doing?
I am well. How are you?
I'm doing great. So I'm so excited to have you on the show because, you know, when we are typically in fellowship with one another, I hear you speak periodically, and I'm sitting there going, man, okay, that was good, that was deep. And I'm more quiet and more reflective, and I'm always listening and thinking. And I'm like, man, I've got to get her on to talk about this issue of grief in particular. And to our listening audience, that's really what I want to focus on today. And Dr. Eaddy is uniquely qualified to help us deal with grief and also talk about anger and the unhealthy manifestations of this. So here's what hit me, and this was really the impetus behind me calling you. I really came to understand any change in our normal way of living and or acting produces grief. When we have loss, right, it produces a level of grief at some level. And then I thought, and I was like, wow, you know what? We're really going through like global grief. Like the whole world is grieving. We've lost our way of living. We've lost this sense of control that we thought we had. We've lost family members. People have lost jobs, those things that they have used to define themselves and define their self-worth. They've lost those things. And it's like, man. And so I was talking to my wife, and she said to me, you know, there's something she's just realizing now, and she's identifying the cause, which is helping her make sense of some things. So that's what I want you to do for us today. Help us make sense of this idea of global grief. I know you've been thinking about it. You've been dealing with it locally. You've been dealing with it in your congregation. Help us understand what grief is and this idea of global grief.
Yeah. So thank you. Thank you for having me. It's such an important topic. You started right on target, right? So we grieve more than just death. So we have the death of a loved one. We know that that causes grief, but grief is caused by any kind of loss, which means that we are grieving constantly if we allow ourselves to. The loss of normalcy, Many folks are not able to go to work or they've been laid off. We can't go outdoors in the way that we used to. Our children can't be in school. The loss of normalcy, the loss of sort of financial stability for those who have lost employment, lost income, the loss of community. We are not gathering in sanctuaries anymore. We are unable to just go down the street to a friend's house. We have suffered so many losses, and those are sort of individual and maybe even communal losses. But then there's just that global loss. There's a loss of travel. I can't travel outside of, now you may be able to, but in general, just the way we are sort of stuck at home, stuck in a workplace. If you work in a place like myself in a hospital, we are grieving the life that we had. Whatever kind of life that was, we are grieving the life that we had. And part of understanding grief is understanding that anytime we lose something, grief is there. There are people who have been divorced or who are divorced. They grieve that. Children are grieving the fact that they can't meet up with their friends in the schoolyard. All of that causes grief for us. Any loss causes grief. And so it's important for us to realize that it's not just the death of a loved one, that relationships die, opportunities die. All of that is lost. And the first step for us in this grieving process is recognizing that we are grieving. Also, we are in what's called anticipatory grief, right? So I know I'm going to lose something soon. The possibility of loss is right there. You mentioned a friend of yours who was in the hospital. You thought he was going to get better. There may have been someone else who didn't think he was going to get better. So the anticipatory grief was already starting. They may not come home. And if you consider the number of people right now that are in hospitals, not just for not just for COVID, but for the normal things that folks are coming to the hospital for. We're still doing transplants here. The family of that patient can be going through anticipatory grief. They do not know if their loved one is going to come home. And we grieve that. And all of that works its way out in our bodies, in our minds. Some folks want to know, like, how does grief manifest itself? It can manifest itself physically, right? So you might start getting headaches, backaches. A friend of mine said, I've been tired every day. And she's one who runs marathons, right? She's always energetic. I'm tired every day. That's grief. That's grief. It manifests itself cognitively. And I'll be very candid with your audience that there are times when I'm not focused. My mind, my thought is scattered. That's a part of grief. It manifests itself sort of behaviorally. There are people who are starting to distance themselves even from communication because they are grieving, and that is how they exercise, if you will, that grief. It manifests itself emotionally. And you talked about anger. Grief manifests itself through anger, through sadness, through fear, through anxiety.
It's interesting you say that, because there's this sense of anger turned inward, right? That can produce depression. I had somebody say to me, I think I'm angry with God. I know that's not the right thing to say, but I feel like I'm angry towards God. And I'm like, no, you can be angry at God, especially if you think you've done everything that God has called you to do, and somehow God is not responding the way you want him to. So help our listening audience really understand these manifestations, because I think it's important for people to know first that it's normal, that there's like nothing wrong with you. Am I on point with that?
You are on point. We tell people every day, we normalize. As a chaplain, it is my job to normalize your experience, your feelings. So anger is common. Fear is common. Anxiety is common. Sadness is common. One of the things about grief, and you started with this, is often we make people feel that what they are experiencing is different. We want to push them out of the grief so that they can be normal again. But after you lose a job, you may be sad, you may be angry. That is a common expression of grief. And another piece of that is that we all grieve differently. You know, back in the day, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross had those 5 stages of grief, and you start with denial, then you go to anger, then it's depression. Now I'm bargaining, then I'm accepting. She later kind of threw that out the window. Because people thought that their grief was going to go in a cycle. And once they got to a place where they felt acceptance, then they would no longer be grieving. But the truth is that we go in and out of phases.
Right. We move all around.
Right. Yeah. Possibly through the rest of our lives.
Yeah. Yeah.
It may not be as sharp 10 years from now as it is today. But there still may be moments where you are experiencing that, and that's normal. I'll share a story with you, and your audience may understand this. When I was 13, so we're talking many decades ago, my cousin died, and she was a second mother to me. She died, and so we're talking 30 years later. Her children, who are my best friends, their father died, and I was asked to do the funeral. When I walked into that funeral home, I broke down. Not because I was doing his funeral, but because of the death of my cousin from 30 years ago surfaced.
Wow.
It surfaced powerfully. And I had to excuse myself for a moment to feel what I was feeling, right? It came back 30 years later to feel what I was feeling and to recognize that that's normal. It's normal. And feel what you're feeling. If you are angry, you need to feel that anger. Now, we don't want you to go out and hurt someone or hurt yourself. So there are things that you can do with the anger. But if you're angry, acknowledge that. God, I am angry because my loved one died. God, I am angry because I can't make ends meet. God, I am angry because my whole world has changed. There is no sense of normalcy. It is okay to acknowledge that anger. It's okay to acknowledge that sadness. And as I talked about with anticipatory grief, it's okay to acknowledge that fear that something might happen. It hasn't happened yet, but the possibility is there. When you go into the grocery store, the possibility of getting sick is there. Right. And you may be grieving that your body is already responding to that, and it's normal. So we need to let people know that what you feel is common. You are not an outlier. And it is okay to, I tell people, feel what you feel.
Wow. I want to thank you. You're listening to Real World, Real Talk. I'm Dr. DZ Cofield, and I have with me as my guest in our virtual studio, Dr. Jamie Eaddy. You talk about grief having many dialects, and I love that idea of grief dialects. I think you've already alluded to it, but for our listening audience, just expound on that a little bit, because I think for me, as I'm dealing with people, I'm accepting now and recognizing that there are times that you get this normal or abnormal behavior, and I don't necessarily equate it to grief. And you talk about grief affecting everyone. So if you can, just let's put a quarter in the meter and park there for a second, just about grief, how it affects all family members. You say it's not just somebody dying, it's more than that. And children are affected by grief and their loss. And, I remember somebody saying, it's just puppy love. And somebody retorted and said, well, it's love to the puppy, and so where we don't see it as something significant, right? That grief for that child, even if it's the loss of a toy or can't get hugs from Nana, whatever it is, that grief is significant in a very real way. So let's talk about that as we look at families and people across generations.
Yeah. So every loss is real for the person who loses whatever the thing is. It's real. And so to minimize that is unhealthy. So a child who can no longer go to recess with their best friend in school is experiencing a type of grief. And as the parent, you may be saying, well, you have toys here, you can play here, but that doesn't take away from their grief. And we need to acknowledge that they are grieving. The parent who may now be working from home, for example, and is unable to go to the workplace and unable to have sort of their own personal space because everyone is home now. They may be grieving personal space. If you lost your job, you're grieving the loss of income. You are grieving the fact that you can't go to worship and community. So all of those different types of grieving is happening in someone's home. One thing I say about children is, I think if we as adults modeled our grief or acknowledged our grief a little better, then we may be able to help children to acknowledge and talk about their grief. So I've been encouraging families to sit down together and talk about their loss. And one family, everybody had note cards and they just wrote out what they lost. And one of the kids wrote, they lost pizza because on whatever particular day of the week in school, they got pizza. And that's a loss to them because they're not with their friends eating pizza. The mother said that, she lost community with her friends because they had a book club and they met every other week. Two different, very different things, wow, but still significant losses. The husband who still has to go to work, right? So he's lost this sort of sense of safety and security because he's engaging in the workplace, in the world, and that might be dangerous for him. He's also lost a sense of security that he can protect his family because he's going into the workplace. When he comes home, is it safe? Can I hug my wife? Can I spend time with my children? Or do I withdraw to keep them safe? So now there's so many different kinds of losses that families are dealing with. And within that, we are all feeling a different kind of emotion. So the child who can no longer have pizza might be sad, but because they don't know how to sort of sit in sadness, it becomes an acting out, if you will, right? So yeah, they throw their toys. You say, listen, pick the toy up. No, I don't want. So that's the child. The mother, the father, the parent, the spouse, the significant other, whomever in the house, may be becoming withdrawn and depressed. So they may start picking up other habits or withdrawing from the family, not communicating with the family. All of these grieving different kinds of losses, and we are at a different stage or a different place in how we are responding to the grief. So in any given house, you could have people grieving 20 or 30 different things, and each of them in a different spot in that grieving. One anger, one sad, one anxious, because we don't really talk about anxiety as a response to grief.
Right.
That's the possibility in one house.
So it seems like, based on what you're saying, there can be a collision of all of these different dialects. I'm grieving, you're grieving. We're not necessarily grieving the same way
or the same thing.
I want my grief to be consoled. Everybody else wants their grief consoled. I want my grief to be viewed as important.
Yeah.
And when we're locked in with each other and everybody's grieving, there's really no outlet. There's no relief. I want you to speak a little bit about what you have learned in your work. And I think you're uniquely qualified. One of the things we talked about off air is just being this lifelong learner. And you have a multiplicity of disciplines that you walk in. So as you look at these disciplines, certified to deal with anger, deal with grief, you walk with families through processes. As an ordained minister, you deal with grief, and then your own grief. Talk about the importance of unraveling that grief. What does that look like? How you've done it personally, and how you've led other people to do it.
Yeah. So one of the things we did recently, we had a talk with the mayor's office in the Philadelphia community, and we talked about unraveling. That unraveling is it's healthy and it's necessary because, as you mentioned, I am walking with people who are grieving, but I too am grieving. And so I must find ways to acknowledge my own grief, to feel my grief. And that's the unraveling is the feeling, is the letting go, is the sitting in. And it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to sit in that place of sadness or anger, especially when you can't really do anything about the cause of it right now. So we say unravel, allow yourself to come apart a bit, right? Allow yourself in a safe space to let go. Allow yourself to we talk about dancing and laughing and screaming, all of these ways that we can sort of let out our emotion. That's unraveling, and it's necessary. We must do that. What I have found that has helped families, especially if we go back to the family that we talked about, where everyone is in the house grieving a different kind of loss and in a different place within their grief, expressing different emotions within their stages of grief. We have found that rituals are helpful, that figuring out a way to talk within the family about the fact that we are all grieving. And this is hard work. This is why, pastors are important. Pastoral care practitioners like myself are important. Chaplains are important, because we can help give you framework for how you can discuss this within your own personal community. So being able to say, okay, the 2 children are grieving, the aunt who is staying with us is grieving, the parents are all grieving. We must all acknowledge that. And so we acknowledge that. This is what I'm grieving. I talked about the note cards. Being able to say that and to let each person share what they are grieving, and for you to receive that as important, as significant. Those are part of the ways that we allow one another to unravel, as well as unravel ourselves. One thing that I encourage people as someone is unraveling is to never put yourself in their space, like never do the comparison thing. So, I also lost a mom. As part of helping them unravel, to show them that this is what can happen when you have a certain kind of loss, because our loss is different and the way we respond to that loss is different. And once you tell me about your loss, we often say you've taken the attention off of my loss. So when a family is grieving, we have to find a way to share in the how we give attention to one another in that loss. So acknowledging that we all have lost, being able to communicate what we've lost to one another, and being able to feel that individually as well as in community. And with children, it's helpful for parents to have the conversation, to say, I know that, or I know you're no longer able to go to lunch with whomever. How does that make you feel? Because I know when I can't go to lunch with my friends, sometimes it makes me sad. To help children understand that this thing is real and it's okay to feel it, is part of helping them unravel. Yeah. And together, we can unravel together in a healthy way, in a way that allows each of us to sit in our own pain, as well as to acknowledge the pain of our neighbor, whoever that neighbor might be. And I think we're going to have to do that now and in the days to come, if we are going to make it through this and be on the other side healthy and whole.
Yeah. So I heard a therapist say to an audience, don't ever go to a therapist who doesn't have a therapist, right? As you're walking through this, I want to talk about that and kind of expound on that on several levels. First, I want you to talk to the Christian who feels like it's unspiritual to grieve, who feels like it's unspiritual to get angry that there's something wrong with them in their walk with God, if they're dealing with or battling this emotion or this mindset, or they're exhausted, as you said, or tired, or they're snappy, whatever that grief dialect is. Help our listening audience to understand that spirituality doesn't exempt you from dealing with that.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. One thing I find in our faith community sometimes is that we have these cliches that we attempt to move people beyond their grief into some place of sort of victory, in order to help them be more spiritual, right? So we tell them some sort of cliche, and hopefully they'll be better on the other side of that cliche. They'll recognize their strength and they'll recognize their victory. And that's because I think we don't believe that it's okay to have emotion, to feel, to grieve. But our example in Jesus is that Jesus showed emotion. If we look at the text, Jesus was angry, he turned over tables. Jesus was sad, he cried at the death of a friend. These are emotions. You know, you don't cry without an emotion. So there's sadness there. So Jesus already models for us that in our humanity, that we are going to be sad. We may feel anger. Those expressions, those emotions are normal, and it is human to feel. When we don't allow ourselves to feel, we are really blocking access to our humanity. And you know, I think it's important for Christians, for people of faith, to recognize that feeling is normal, and that God gives us permission to feel. And to go a step further, that sometimes what we feel is not something that can be worked through alone. It may also not be something that can be worked through with your chaplain or your pastoral care minister or your pastor. There are even some things that we feel where we have to go to therapy in order to address our mental, emotional, and spiritual health, which is all tied into our feelings. So to those who are people of faith who are listening, it's okay to feel. It is human to feel. And if we just examine the text, we see that Jesus felt throughout his life. We get to witness his response to feeling. We get to witness his response to sadness. And that should be a model for us. That should remind us daily that it's okay to feel. And we have a God who tells us to bring all of that to God anyway, right? So whether we acknowledge that we are sad, our body knows we're sad. Whether we acknowledge that we're angry, our body knows we're angry. So not acknowledging the feeling doesn't mean the feeling is not having an impact on us. I even believe that sometimes our stress and our tension, it gets in our bones, it gets in our necks, it gets in our shoulders and our backs. We start to have back pain because we're carrying some anger that's unacknowledged. You know, so yes, people of faith, it is righteous to acknowledge how we feel. It is truth. It is honest. It is our humanity. And God welcomes that. God is big enough to handle everything we feel, whether it be sadness or anger. Even when that anger is directed to God, God is big enough to handle all of it.
You know, I think it's amazing that you say that, because you're absolutely right. It's not acting in faith to live in denial.
That's a good way to say it.
You know, our faith in God really makes it a necessity that we take to God the reality of our pain, what we're feeling, and to be honest, even if it's, I'm angry with God, you know, hey, God, I'm angry with you. I mean, that's what Job did, right?
Yeah.
He went to God. I mean, and it's interesting because in that dialogue, you know, God had to remind Job that he was not God, and there were some answers that he wanted that he couldn't provide himself that were above his pay grade.
Right. And so we try to, I'm glad you said that, we try to answer, we want to give people answers to their grief.
Yeah.
We want to give them just answer this solution, and sometimes there is none. And to be comfortable in our discomfort with the fact that there is no answer to that.
So, you know, you posted something not long ago that I thought was powerful, and it reminded me of when my mother passed away. You talk about people trying to identify, oh, I know how you feel. But for me, the most moving thing was the power of presence. And you talked about that just how important that is, just to be there and to highlight your point, to listen, to allow people to just share.
Yeah.
Because they don't necessarily need somebody who knows it all. They just need somebody to affirm them in their feelings.
Yeah.
Let's shift for a minute, because time is moving fast, to this issue of self-care.
Yeah.
And I think for our community, we kind of specialize in self-care, even if it's not good self-care, right? We go to excesses, and we see our friends on corners and pick up some pharmaceutical products and some other things that we do. But help us understand this issue of self-care, because I think there's somebody who's listening right now who is at a place where the hole is so deep they can't get out.
Yeah.
They've tried to get out, and these are unique situations and circumstances that we're dealing with now. When we talk about COVID-19 and the pandemic and furloughs and people still waiting on their $1,200, they haven't gotten that yet, and everything that's going on and reopening and opening. I'm firmly convinced that, if you open up a store, it doesn't matter, because people still not coming. And if they do come, some of them don't have any money. You got people who are fighting landlords, even though we're telling them that landlords are not going to put them out. And the JP courts have said we're not going to, but they're still being pressured and bullied by landlords and the like. Struggling food insecurities, all of these things. Help us navigate this issue of self-care. When is self-care helpful?
Yeah.
And when have we gotten to a place where we got to move beyond self-care?
That's good. That's good. First, let's just make sure we give people a picture of self-care, right? Because often you'll see in magazines, people are talking about sort of pleasurable things. So for women, sometimes and men, manicures and pedicures and massages and those types of things as forms of self-care. Vacations, yes, that is a form of self-care, and that's good if and when you can do it.
Yeah, and I think that, Jamie, let me interrupt you there. I think that's part of the challenge, right? Because I was talking to a friend and she's like, "Man, I'm supposed to be on a plane going somewhere right now. Like, I'm supposed to be getting away." Well, all of those modes of self-care that we have typically used are like gone. They are off the table.
So understanding that self-care is that, and I think that's one of the problems, because we made that sort of our totality of self-care, but self-care is more than that. Self-care deals with looking after our whole selves, which means that for me, self-care includes having a therapist to whom I can sit on, well, virtually now, where I can unload some of what I deal with in the work that I do, and can be unburdened and find some clear headspace because I was able to share the trouble, the discomfort, the dis-ease that I'm carrying just as a result of the work I do. So for some, self-care is going to mean finding a way to clear up some headspace, finding a way to ease the tension in your mind, which means I may talk to a friend. It could be through prayer or meditation. There are various ways that we care for our whole selves. Dr. Valerie Bridgman, who is friend, mentor, just a wonderful woman of God, she posts every day on Facebook, did you drink water? Did you stretch? Did you look out the window or sort of go outside for a moment? Because those things are also part of our self-care. Drinking water sounds really simple, but it is a part of self-care. So expanding our definition of self-care beyond being able to travel, beyond being able to get our hair or nails done or massages, expanding our definition of self-care to what does it take to tend to the soul? What does it take to tend to the whole being? which includes maybe therapy, which may include exercise, getting up and stretching. And I know we can't go to the gym, but if we have stairs in our house, we can walk up and down the stairs a few times. Like there are other things about self-care that are important to our healing and our wholeness. And I think it's important for us to begin to sit down and to define that for ourselves, because it's going to be different. What makes me feel healthy and whole? And it has to be something beyond the external, where I go get my nails done or get my hair. It has to be. As you mentioned, we don't have access to that now. Also, financially, with all of what's going on, we may not have the financial resources, even if we had access to do that now. So it's important that we figure out ways to ease our minds, to release our stress and our tension ourselves, and not necessarily through bubble baths and massages. Although, again, if you can do that, I think it's great. But it's going to take more. It takes a woman who is grieving, say the loss of a significant other, a man who is grieving the loss of a child, needs more than a bubble bath for self-care.
Mm.
They need more than a bubble bath for self-care. They need a way to have their grief and their grief acknowledged. They need to be in a space where I can say, this is what I'm feeling, without you necessarily giving me an answer. Because the truth is, there is no answer that you will be able to give that will satisfy the pain of my loss. You can't tell me that God needed my loved one more. You can't. There's nothing you can say to satisfy the loss. So being able to be a presence and listening will open up a world of healing for someone who needs to talk. And the truth is, right now, all of us need to talk.
Yeah. If you're just tuning in, you're listening to Real World, Real Talk. I'm your host, Dr. DZ Cofield. I have with me in our virtual studio, Dr. Jamie Eaddy, and she is giving us some insight on this issue of grief. And I think for me, coming out of this is first the understanding that everyone
has it,
is dealing with grief.
Yep.
All of us are dealing with loss.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about flattening the pandemic's effects physically and not overwhelming hospitals and medical institutions, but in a very real sense, we've been overwhelmed mentally.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that is important that you have pointed out is that when we talk about everyone grieving, everyone's grief is important.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone's grief matters, and grief is intergenerational.
Yeah.
Our children are grieving, our grandchildren are grieving, and typically I think grief makes us kind of myopic. When we're grieving, we don't think about anybody else grieving. It's just what I'm going through, and you need to understand what I'm going through. And as you stated, if you're in a home with people and everybody's grieving, then everybody's focusing on their grief, and you'll get some lashing out, and you'll get some unhealthy conversations and the like that will come out of that. Talk about how this is affecting your practice. Philadelphia has not been the hotspot that New York is, but it's still a major metropolitan city, and you've seen numbers go up, and you're seeing people deal with all of this. How has this shaped and changed your practice for this season?
Yeah, so I'm in the hospital even now, and there was a day when people could come into the hospital to visit a loved one. Whether this is pre-COVID, you could come into the hospital and visit your loved ones. Now we are in a day where you are unable to do that, and this is not just for patients who are dealing with the coronavirus. This is in general. You cannot step foot in the hospital. There are some exceptions, of course. I have had to find new ways to be present with people where we are not physically together. Part of my gift, to be honest, is to be close enough to people so that they feel the empathy, that they know that I'm with them. And something happens when we are together that allows people to release their emotion, to come into to contact with what they are feeling deep inside. And my gift is that I'm able to do that when I'm with you. I can't be with you now. So I've had to find ways to do this virtually, and it's different. And I'm grieving contact. So I'm grieving being able to be there for someone in the way I'm used to being there. In the hospital, as I mentioned, folks are unable to come in. So I am at the bedside of people who are actively dying. And normally their family would be around them. They can't. So I am doing virtual, I am proxy in the room now with a family on my iPhone or my iPad so that they can see and say last words to their loved one.
Wow.
I'm having to find a way to be there to, there's something to be said about being present with someone and there's a pause and you can look them in the eye during that pause.
Yeah.
I have to be on the phone with you and there's a pause. You can't see that I'm thinking of you, right? So there's this whole new world of trying to be there to help people through this grief. And it is new, it's unfamiliar to me. So I'm trying to make my way through it. But the biggest change is really this virtual visit, especially at the end of life, is having to witness families who cannot be present with their loved one, for their loved one. And that's a ritual that many communities have. That end of life, we come by and we say, we love you, grandmama, and how much you mean to me. That's part of our healing ritual even. And so now there's a break. There's this break because I'm here, but you're not. Even though you may get the witness via camera, it's not the same as being here. And so that is what's happening in my practice today, that there are still some fractures in our process to helping people grieve. And it's no one's fault. It is what it is right now. Especially if it can't be on camera and I just have to do it by phone.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's interesting, even in the group that we fellowship in, I don't know if everybody is even aware of how we're impacted by grief on a variety of levels, including the grief of not seeing members, but the grief of not being in the pulpit and being able to preach in that familiar way that you would preach in normally, the grief of not traveling, of not, fellowshipping. I mean, it's just multi-layered. And I'm just sitting there going like, wow, like no wonder I've been feeling this way, or no wonder I've been doing this.
And you're naming it though. You're naming it. And I think in our group, that's not just our group, but in general, is the challenge is that we're not naming it grief.
Yeah,
so
right.
You're not supposed to feel it.
Right.
If you're a pastor and your congregation hasn't seen you in 2.5 months, almost 3 months, you're grieving. And to name it is part of your process of working through it.
Yeah. No, absolutely, man. It's crazy. I mean, I'm just like, man, this is yeah. Dr. Eaddy, thank you for sharing with us. Let me just give you a couple of moments, however the Lord leads you, to share with our listeners to help them walk through this time, because I think there's so many messages that are out there, but not enough of them are tailored around what we've talked about on today. Not enough of them are tailored around, here's what it is.
Yeah.
You can identify the dialects, but you don't even know the language that you're speaking. And you're really speaking the language of grief.
Yeah.
With all of these manifestations, it comes down to this. Just take a few moments, if you will, and just talk to our audience to encourage them as they go through this time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I know that probably many of you, like myself, have found yourself in this new world, this new space that you did not ask to be in, that you did not even anticipate you would be in. and you are feeling things, and I say things because sometimes we don't know quite what we're feeling. Is it anger? Is it sadness? Is it all of the above? I want you to know that everything that you feel is normal, is common. I want to encourage you to feel it. I want to encourage you that as you are in contact with community, whether that is your family, whether it's your workplace, whatever community surrounds you, that you are able to acknowledge their grief and name your own grief, that you are able to set boundaries so that you give yourself permission to grieve. Some people are waiting for permission to cry. You have permission today on Friday, the 22nd of May. You have permission to feel. And if that means crying, then I want you to cry. I want us, you and I, to find a way to create a ritual that allows us to be in touch with our grief. And that might mean that once a week you're writing down the names of people or the things that you've lost, so that you can get it out, so that there's an acknowledgement that we can honor the fact that this has changed my life, and I don't have to hide it, and I don't have to hide from it. And for those of you who are trying to provide support, because I know that many of us will set aside our own pain, our own grief to love and to support and to care for others. And I admire that, but at the same time, I don't want you to lose sight of the fact that if you don't tend to your own grief, your grief will tend to you. And so be sure that even as you provide others support, this is pastors, chaplains, any particular caregiver, if you are providing support, I need you to take time for yourself. I need you to acknowledge and to name your own feelings as much as you try to help others name theirs. I need you to be able to sit in the discomfort that there are no answers for your grief or for your neighbor's grief. And I need you to get help when you need it. We often take on all of the responsibility ourselves because we know I'm capable of helping people through this. But don't allow yourself to be so bound by your own grief as you help others that you do sort of damage to your own soul. And for those of us who are in a position to be present for those who are grieving, even as we grieve ourselves, remember that empathy is not comparing your loss to their loss. Empathy is not telling them how they'll grow as a result of what they've lost. Empathy is not showing them the bright side of things. That's not empathy. Empathy is meeting me in the mud with my tears and my anger. Empathy is meeting me, is getting muddy with me and sitting with me while I feel what I feel. So that when it's time for me to stand up, you can stand up with me and we can walk out of the mud together. That's what empathy is. And so as you care for yourselves and as you care for others, remember those things. You are important. What you feel is important. And in order to be healthy and whole through this, and as well as on the other side, I need you to care for yourself today. And so that's what I would tell all of the listeners, whether they are providing care for others or not. Tend to your grief. And if you believe in a higher power, if you believe in God, know that God is big enough to handle everything you feel. God is big enough to handle what you feel, even if that feeling is toward God. So feel it. If you want to take it to God, because that's your ultimate source of life, do that. God does tell us to cast our cares. And so do that. But you got to name that grief if you plan to work through it. And only in the working through it do we lighten our load. So that's what I would encourage our community of listeners to do today.
Dr. Jamie Eaddy, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
And man, just continue to allow God to use you.
Thank you.
Blessing the people who are in need. The late Vernon John said, if you see a good fight, get in it. I always add, if you don't see a good fight, start one. And the fight for your own mental health and mental well-being is a fight that you definitely want to engage in. Here's one of the things that I have learned, and Dr. Eaddy just mentioned it. You don't need somebody else's permission to grieve. You don't need their approval to grieve. As a matter of fact, you need to learn how to protect your own space. And one of the reasons you need to protect your own space and carve out that space is because other people don't know what you're going through. They don't know what you're feeling. And sometimes that means, you know what? I can't answer the phone right now. Sometimes that means I can't entertain the foolishness. I can't hear your problem because I'm dealing with my own stuff. My wife and I were talking. She, in a former life, was a flight attendant. And I asked her the question the other day. I said, what happens when there's a change in cabin pressure? And she said, the mask drop. I said, and what instructions do you give? Put your mask on. And if you are traveling with somebody who needs assistance, put your mask on first, so you are equipped and enabled to help somebody else. And so now we have a phrase. Whenever we see each other getting off track, we'll tell each other, put your mask on. Make sure you take care of yourself so you can be a blessing to others. Thank you for tuning in to this edition of Real World, Real Talk. I'm Dr. DZ Cofield. It's time to get out of here. Peace.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Real World, Real Talk. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast to be notified of new episodes every week. Follow us via social media using the @RWRTDZ username on all platforms: YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. To submit any comments, questions, sponsor opportunities, or future show suggestions, visit us online at rwrtdz.com or via email at info@rwrtdz.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope you've been inspired to be the change you want to see in the world today. Until next time, be real, keep it real, and stay real.
Put your mask on first.